Yeah, good morning. It's really a privilege to be part of this conference. It has been a real intellectual feat, and the panel that we are going to be part of today is going to continue, as a matter of fact, that feat. The topic, as you heard, is about agriculture. It's tackled from different aspects. The aspect of international assistance or the international aid, the aspect of state development, the aspect of incorporation of farmers. We have 4 distinguished speakers. I'm going to mention each one of them, so that way I will not need to go back and forth each time. Our first speaker is Aude Darnal. She's a research analyst and the project manager of Stimson Center in DC. And second speaker is Simon Manda, a lecturer at the University of Leeds in the UK. And the third speaker is Giuliano Martiniello. He's from the International University of Rabat. He's not Moroccan. He may look Moroccan, but he's not. He's Italian. And last but not least, Wendy Wolford, Vice Provost for International Affairs, and Robert and Ruth Porson of Global Development at Cornell University. Please join me to welcome our distinguished speakers.
Good morning, everyone. And before starting, I would like to thank Grieve and Zainab and obviously the Africa Institute for allowing me to be here today. In this panel, we're going to talk about agricultural land and structural transformation, and my talk is about aid. And so you might wonder, why am I on this panel? I'm actually going to link this question of aid with agriculture. In fact, as I was looking at the title of my presentation, I was seeing perhaps some contradiction between decolonizing and radically transform international assistance. I mean, what does it mean exactly? And just before, Vinjay was saying that, you know, he's tired of the word decolonizing and is more of an anti-colonial believer, and I think he's actually right. So today I want to discuss the question of aid and the future of aid as we commonly understand it as either a tool or a challenge to achieve economic development, and its link with agriculture and structural transformation in Africa. I am going to use my empirical experience as a former worker in the international aid sector in Guinea, in Nigeria, and Cameroon. So I worked in the usual international NGOs. I saw how it works from within. And then I became very skeptical about it, and then I moved to policy to try to change things. And so I would like, before starting as well, to just talk about the broader context, right? I am placing this in conversation within, you know, the cause for reforming the world order, from reforming the Bretton Woods institutions to North-South relationships. And obviously there are an increasing number of discussions about climate financing, development financing, and within that, we hear more and more, you know, calls for more financing, but also more grants, more aid. And I do feel like, as someone who works in Washington and where, you know, I hear constantly these calls for more grants, there is quite a disconnection from these calls, from the discussions about the reform and radical transformation of aid. Usually how we hear it as decolonizing aid. And so as we call for bigger grants and more money through grants, through aid, we see that there is a certain status quo and very slow changes in the frameworks, the mechanisms, and the systems that impede some champions of change agency, their interest and knowledge. And so within that, there are calls for reforming aid. And I see kind of 3 buckets. First, you have the Western leaders who call for fewer aid. I mean, in the United States, we have Trump now, who is saying that he wants to just reduce, you know, aid packages. Then you have those calling from decolonizing aid, so shifting from Western to endogenous frameworks of knowledge and practices, moving away from the colonial dynamics, the dependency cycle, neocolonial practices, marginalization of local people, knowledge and methodologies that favor former colonial power paradigms. And then you have the final bucket, which is about retiring aids entirely. And so, the idea that reform is not possible, we just need to stop with aid entirely and move towards something else. So as I mentioned, I worked within the international aid industry. I called it an aid industry. I call it because, in my opinion, this is an industry, right? We're talking about an economic business industry of billions of dollars. And as I said earlier, I became very skeptical about it. In full disclosure, down the line, I do believe that we need to move away from aid entirely because I think it is extremely difficult to decolonize aid and to reform it because it is rooted in colonial history, because it is rooted in racism. I simply do not have much hope that we can unroot that from aid. And so I do believe that down the line we need to think and develop other systems. And so the link with agriculture is that even though I worked in the peace building and development sectors, when discussing with my peers in the agricultural sector who benefits from this international aid, I realized that the same challenges were also existed, whether in the peace building and the agricultural sector. So before going into this particular sector of agriculture, just wanted to go back to the question of what does it mean when you talk about redefining or retiring international assistance. So obviously we know that aid is rooted, as I mentioned, in very patronizing stances, paternalism as well, and obviously racism and colonial heritages. There is no consensus, right? Many advocate for the continuing aid. Others calls for reform. And while there are many good discussions about decolonizing aid, what it means in replacing local actors at the center of the debates, giving them their agency, not looking at them as mere beneficiaries, but active actors of the system from the very design of projects to monitoring and evaluation, I find that there is little discussion about what an alternative to AIDS would be. Quite often, pushbacks again, the very question of reforming AIDS focus on the usual lack of capacities of local actors, the risk for investments, the lack of resources from donors. And I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that it's also, it's fundamentally, I believe, a question of power balance, right? Because at the end of the day, and this is what we were discussing just earlier with Majid, is that when donors provide aid, there is a power relation that is at play. In reforming aids, giving the power back to the so-called beneficiaries, the actors of change, is accepting to give that power back, is accepting to sharing or giving it to a much larger extent to local actors. And so these power dynamics are central in the question, in the economy of aid. And this is not just about donors, it's also about international NGOs. And there again, there are an economic interest at play. So all of that to say that even, as I mentioned, the lack of conversation about what alternative exists, there is also lack of conversation about donors' capacities. It is always about the capacities and skills of local actors, but not so much about the capacities of donors. And we know that in the discussion about reforming aid, donors need to actually strengthen their skills and capacities. whether it is financial or human resources, because usually when it comes to financing local actors with the localization agenda, that usually means that you will have to deal with a higher number of grants, usually smaller, and so donors simply do not have the capacity to deal with that. But also they are obviously evolving within paradigms that are Western, that are based on their understanding of what aid should look like, of what solutions should look like. And I think that there is definitely a lack of capacity in understanding that solutions elsewhere may not be what you decide in Washington, D.C. or Brussels or Paris, for instance. So then, within that framework, the question is, can aid be decolonized? Can we move away from the racism the racist frameworks upon which aid has been developed? Can we move away from paternalism? Can we move towards a system where this power that is currently held by a minority is redistributed? And so that's where I'm quite frankly very skeptical, and that's what I said, that at the end of the day, I do think that we need to think beyond aid. And so thinking beyond aid also means that we need to develop new concepts based on Southern scholarship, and I think that's been quite central to the conference over the past 2 days. So we're not simply talking about changing the name of aid and calling it something else. It is fundamentally a shift of framework, developed new systems, new mechanisms, in something where equity and equality is at the center of that. Actually, yesterday, I don't remember, someone told me about reparations and what I thought about reparations. I do believe that reparation is an interesting concept because it acknowledged the impact of colonialism, the inequity of the current world order, of extractivism, and it places the onus on those who are responsible for these inequalities. It also replaced agencies in the hands of global South stakeholders, and there is obviously this fundamental sense of justice that is not necessarily there with the aid system. However, as much as I appreciate the concept of reparation, the question is, how do we implement that? If we remain in the system where Western actors have the economic power of providing this assistance or whatever, that reparation, how do we implement that when we know that just a single term reparation in some places such as Washington just creates a lot of debates is not necessarily very well welcomed. So then we move to the question of retiring aids. I like to make this analogy with the question of reforming the international financial architecture. I think we discussed that as well the past few days. When we talk about reforming the World Bank, the IMF, is it even possible, or should we just simply creating new institutions? It's a bit of the same debates for me for aid. As I mentioned earlier, can we actually reform it, or should we just move towards a new system? So then comes the question of what is that new system? In my paper, I talk about social entrepreneurship, so non-profit social entrepreneurship, which I based on my work with some peers in Senegal, the Collectif des Volontaires du Sénégal. They actually do not call them, so they call themselves, volontaires. They are social actors of change. And I do believe that this is an interesting concept in the sense that it links social initiatives to the entrepreneurship world. We move away from this concept of seeing actors of change as beneficiaries, and we look at them as entrepreneurs, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. Whether it is a formal NGO or the informal sector, those actors of change are entrepreneurs. They are building projects, they are designing theories of change, and they are implementing them. So then, should we talk about investments? But in the concept of social change, what is that investment, since there is quite often no return? So investments Should we talk about social returns as opposed to economic returns? So those are just a few questions. I'm asking a lot of questions and not necessarily bringing solutions, but I think that those are interesting conversations that need to be had and which are unfortunately quite absent from the discussion as we continue to focus on aid as it is currently and trying to reform it and decolonizing it. Now, when it comes to agriculture, the reason, well, one of the way that the way I'm making the link with agriculture is that there is international aid also exists within the agricultural sector. I recently had a chat with Aude. He's an agripreneur, so agriculture entrepreneur in Senegal. He's also part of the collective of volunteers in Senegal. And we had this discussion about his views of international aid within the agricultural sector. And it's funny because every single thing he said are the same issues that I saw when I used to work in Guinea, for instance, in the so-called peace building sector. And so, you know, obviously we know the importance of the agricultural system, the agricultural sector for economic development on the continent, and the various issues that it faces, but also can address. So unemployment, climate, water scarcity, urban spaces, food autonomy, and so on and so forth. And so Aboubakry was telling me that several things. First of all, exactly what I saw is that big donors, how it usually works, right, is that you have big donors that finance your big international NGOs, or not so big international NGOs, frankly. And then usually they will, when it comes to funding local NGOs, they will fund the same small pool of bigger NGOs who they're acquainted with. Meaning that a plethora of local organizations do not receive funding. And so Aboubakry was also telling me that because of this inequality, many experts leave the agricultural sector to move to those INGOs or to the big multilateral organizations, for instance, the Food and Agriculture Organization. So how does it work usually is that you have projects led by those international NGOs, they receive a grant from a donor, a percentage of that goes to their overheads, which is used to finance HQ. You have also a percentage that goes to your regional offices, where you usually have your foreigners, your Western experts. And then obviously you also have the salaries of your foreign employees. I was a foreign employee. Those salaries that are dramatically higher than local salaries. And so at the end of the day, a very small amount of money actually goes to programmatic design and to local actors. When it comes about AIDS, in 2023, I believe that only 1.2% of humanitarian aid actually went directly to local actors, 1.2%. That's like nothing, even smaller than nothing. And so Aboubakry, was telling me about all these issues, and he was telling me that first of all, we don't want aid. We need investments. Second of all, we need local actors to be supported, right? We need more agricultural experts. We need local actors to be placed at the center of these changes. And how the collective of volunteers of Senegal work is that they act like what I call an incubator. Even though they do not like to use this term just because of the connotation in Senegal. But they have organized themselves with several organizations, informal or formal, of social entrepreneurs, and they seek to attract funding and to then act as a platform that redistribute this funding to the different members of the collective. They provide training. They support these members in terms of being independent. So how do we create a budget? How do we design a project? How do we do monitoring and evaluation? And so the goal is, at the end of the day, to support the independence of these smaller actors and, again, break the dependency cycle that aid sustains. And I found this strategy, this model, to be very interesting because it's allows to address many of the issues that we see with, this usual capacity building coming from Western actors, whereby you have local actors with these capacities coming in and sharing it with their peers. I think it also opened the doors for regional cooperation, right? If you have, I don't know, in Benin, if you're in Senegal, you have colleagues in Benin or peers in Benin that have specific sets of skills, we can actually rely on our regional capacities as opposed to always importing that of the West. So I found this concept to be quite interesting, but again, they are struggling to get funding because they're not part of the big INGOs, they're not part of the big local NGOs, and there continues to be that blanket statement about the lack of capacity, which is usually applied across regions, so from Africa to the Caribbean to Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, across subregions, across countries, which is obviously very problematic. And so I see I only have 1 minute left, so I will try to wrap up very rapidly. But that also obviously brings up the question of the role of local stakeholders, so African governments, the private sector, but also African philanthropies. The collective of volunteers of Senegal is struggling, as I mentioned, to attract funding, public funding as well. Same with the private sector of the philanthropy. So, and I had this discussion with Longo, I don't know where you are in the room, but, where he was mentioning the central place of the government, and I totally agree. It comes back as well to, with this question of non-colonial assistance, how can we rely on our resources as opposed to, again, going into those other systems that create dependence and inequitable dynamics. So that's about it for me. It's, again, there is not, I certainly do not come with a clear-cut answer. A lot of questions, but I think, there are some areas that are not necessarily discussed within the international aid industry, even within the circles of decolonizing aid, which I think are worth considering. I wanted to speak specifically about that collective, the Volontaires de Sénégal and Abou Bakri, who is this agripreneur, because I find their work to be very promising and interesting. And I'm hoping to also hear your views about that. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Maybe first is a complaint to the organizers to next time consider height. Thank you. On behalf of my co-workers who are here today, Bernadette Mwansamushingecherwa, Lizzie Banda, it's a difficult task. If I misrepresent them, they'll immediately correct me, I guess. I would like to sincerely thank the Global Studies University for this opportunity to discuss our work. I would also like to thank the very many people here at the JSU who have worked so hard in the past few months or weeks to make this event possible. To the convener, Grieve Chero, thank you. My task is just to quickly demonstrate that the hype around large-scale agricultural investments in Africa in the post-2007-8 triple crisis in the last frontier of global agricultural expansion in the land-abundant continent, Africa, might be more broadly reflective of the uneven spread of commodification or commoditization that characterizes the world economy, and which ipso facto ensures the production and reproduction of poverty. At a second level, want to demonstrate that large-scale agricultural investment specifically, as with other tendencies of capitalism, assume the ability to define its own habitus, its own practices, customs, vernaculars, and most importantly, hierarchies. And so the move towards more inward-looking foreign direct investments on the continent and the claims around the transformative potential of FDI in agriculture, I think, is more generally unsurprising. It is equally unsurprising, as we would argue in our paper, that it's not, it's going to achieve anything. Whilst poverty more broadly has been framed by international organizations, thank you, as, including policymakers, as fundamentally being about the poor lacking resources, access to resources, we argue through the test case of the Zambian sugar subsector that the agribusiness power of presence, state-capital relations, often coalesce or converge to create a policy and legal context, a market and a trade regime that allows a light-touch approach to the regulation of the industry. And by so doing, the state actors are guilty of creating those conditions for the poor smallholders to struggle to control resources, thereby shaping they struggle to control resources, and they are unable to sort of claw back sizable benefits from these ventures. And we're also trying to show that state oscillation between imposing regulation and removing it, whenever politicians wish so, is reflective of state maneuvers to adhere to a neoliberal logic and ideology that has been present in the country since the 1990s. So we do this by contrasting the first National Development Plan in the 1960s under the first country's president, Kenneth Kaunda, and highlight the divergences that emerged later in the post-1990s. And ultimately, and by looking at the changing relations, enclosures, smallholder conditions and coordination arrangements, circulation of value, labor conditions, gendered impacts, and the response pathways, land conflicts that emerge, we argue that these investments might not necessarily be about solving any problem in the Zambian context, and maybe that's the whole point. And in the context of Thandika Mkandawire's framings, we think that Zambia does not seem to neatly fit into the model envisaged by Mkandawire, and we argue more needs to be done in the context of policy sovereignty and in the context of capacity, specifically execution capacity of agricultural related policy options. We start in our paper with questioning the broader assumptions of agribusiness expansion or large-scale agricultural investments. And we are showing that the global ideological ambassadorship of development actors, again, thank you, have tended to present these investments with remarkable legitimacy, such that making a case against these investment, inward-looking investment, is almost heretical. And these are being used as shorthand politically, these multinational corporations, defined by their ability to disperse resources in countries that do not have the necessary or adequate capital to drive agricultural change. And they're framed in the way that they're advancing the politics of more is better. If something has not worked out, all we need is more investment and things are going to work out. But this ideology is hegemonic more broadly, and it defeats any opposition. I mean, how can one be against better investment, more investment in the country? So we are trying to question the whole architecture of agricultural investment. Can we imagine a situation in which large-scale agricultural investment are declared to have failed or succeeded, both of which would question the entire architecture of the agribusiness expansion? I bet not. So we started looking at the first National Development Plan in Zambia in the 1960s. And we looked at the provisions here. The president or the compatriots of KK are arguing that they are using this framework or policy or vision to provide increased prosperity and higher standards of living for every Zambian. And specifically, they are trying to mobilize resources and favorable factors in order to eliminate obstacles to economic and social development. Those two concepts are very important: mobilization of resources and mobilization of favorable factors to establish conditions for dynamic and sustained growth in the economy. And favorable factors here pointing to stable economy, a sustained source of foreign exchange, a population desirous of self-improvement and hard work. That's very, very important in terms of the attitudes of this bureaucratic structure. They're also talking about boosting hydroelectricity, potential agriculture, and creating a stable industrial and labor relations. We see this period as a period where the state is presenting itself as a platform for transformation more broadly, supported by copper production, obviously. We see this as a way of providing a definable national policy vision, expressed sovereignty and autonomy, and in the policy, it talks about limiting the European influence south of the Zambezi. We're talking about southern Rhodesia, where there was a settler economy there. And also, we're looking at this project or framework as creating an honest civil service through the popular attitudes. And also this sort of investment in the education sector. I think by 1964 independence period, we had about less than 100 graduates in Zambia. So there was that gap. But in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we see this strong government involvement and control of the economy and the control of the agricultural sector. But in the post-1990s, we see that shift towards the neoliberal option. So we have analyzed about 12 policy documents in the post-2000, just to look at their centrality. And we see the emphasis on land use expansion, an emphasis on diversification through entry of new companies, new in the context of foreign companies, an emphasis towards an expansion of irrigation, growth of the market potential of non-traditional agricultural exports, specifically sugar, which is the focus here. We're also looking at the providing sector-specific provisions, including minimum wage in the agricultural sector, which is different from other sectors. But we see more generally something to do with isomorphic mimicry here, that everything that seems to be advanced in these policies tends to integrate and provide that an enabling environment for agribusiness expansion. And interestingly, we see that link to political maneuvers, political statements, and performance of the government is linked to how much investment someone has so-called lured into the country. So 1995, we see former parastatals up for grabs, and the Zambia Sugar, which was a former parastatal, is being privatized, and Ilovo Sugar, South Africa, steps in, and you see this hype in increase in production, increase in not only in-house production, but the integration of small-scale farmers as part of the production expansion move. So 75% of the company is sold to Ilovo. And then in the mid-2000s, we see the EU's everything but arms policy coming into effect. Here we're talking about the Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Sugar Protocol. This trade and development agreement has allowed Zambia to export sugar to the EU market at a guaranteed price. In Zambia, specifically, the EU has supported the development of the Zambian National Sugar Adaptation Strategy. It is this strategy that has sort of shaped the expansion of the sugar subsector more broadly. So we are seeing a supportive policy and legal framework. We are seeing the sugar adaptation strategy being implemented, and the government in the 1996 towards 2000 implemented a vitamin A fortification policy that every sugar sold on the market should be fortified with vitamin A. And for some reason, only the dominant company is able to do that. Of course, a few have come in, but there's sort of a monopolistic sugar structure. We see the centrality of export markets over local markets emerging, seed varieties being drawn from South Africa, and more broadly, a reliance in the sector on foreign suppliers as opposed to local logistics. At a local level, at a regional and local level within the country, we see a concentration of water rights around Zambia Sugar, which still remains the brand name, expansion of sugar production among the small-scale farmers or smallholders, the diversification strategy towards ethanol production and the like, improvement in infrastructure, and development of the wider national sugar trade. But all this is sort of entrenching the dominant position of Zambia Sugar in the industry. And we do an analysis of the different actors and seeing who is more influential. And we're looking at the donors here, we're looking at the government, and most importantly, the EU becoming very, very central in what's going on. We reflect on the state relations. And I would like to quote the former president. I wish to assure South African investors that the investment in Zambia is secure, safeguarded, and progressive, safeguarded by my progressive politics and robust legal framework. In this period, the government implemented the Investment Promotion and Protection Act just to safeguard those investments. And I quote again the former president indicating that and this one is the current, the Zambia Sugar stands out as one of the successful stories of investment in Zambia through growth and job creation, whose impact is felt globally. And we're looking at these politicians making the most of this investment. But the direct outcome of that is a light touch regulation to the industry. And within this period, we saw the government reclassifying the company from an industrial enterprise to an agricultural enterprise. And this assessment, this adjustment, halved the tax burden by the company, crediting them with about $26 million US. And also we saw the company pushing the government to classify sugar production or sugar as a commodity as a sensitive and priority product in policy guidelines. So here we're talking about whether we can classify this company as an agricultural company or an industrial enterprise adding value and the like. At a local level, we are seeing so many or divergent outcomes, reorganizing of patterns of land use at a local level. Different coordination arrangements have emerged. In some cases, some farmers are renting out land to the company to produce on their behalf. Somewhere farmers are running a 14-year lease. Somewhere they are block farms, where households have been displaced, and then you've got a farm block of about 500 hectares of land. Nucleus estates are emerging. And farmers are responding by going to rent out land 9 to 10 kilometers away as a way to ensure food security. The concept here of complex political and economic assemblages, Juliano's work here is very, very important. We see all these different actors coming together, but this is sort of placing smallholder farmers in a different position, a very difficult position. So we get a sense of the adverse incorporation of small-scale farmers into these production arrangements. Social conflict over land have emerged. Gender dynamics are also emerging. Social fragmentation with some farmers relocating away from sugar zones. And we looked at the assumptions of success more broadly. What does it mean to have a successful large-scale agricultural investment in Zambia? So we looked at, we interviewed 4 different groups of stakeholders: government, NGOs, academics, and smallholder farmers. I'm not going to go into details there. But what we found out is that there seems to be a mismatch between the definition of success across different stakeholders. But what seems to go into the policy and legal provisions, the mainstream assumptions and definition of success by the government officers and directors themselves, excluding assumptions and visions from small-scale farmers and NGOs that tend to emphasize different elements. Somewhere in the mid-2000s, ActionAid actually did a report on Zambia Sugar that they've looked at the company taking advantage of lawful loopholes in the international tax law and have benefited from tax breaks offered by the Zambian government. Here we are talking about $17.7 million that the government lost as a result of Zambia Sugar's ability to take advantage of lawful loopholes at an international level. So more broadly, we're also reflecting on investors without benefits, and I think this is what Thandika talks about at some point. Fortunately or unfortunately, we see that Zambia has been left with a narrative legacy far more than the robust empirical legacy of major progress regarding large-scale agricultural investment in the country. And that large-scale agricultural investment can lead to desired outcomes if the country puts in place an enabling environment, that there is always a better way in which investment can reach local communities or touch the ground. Large-scale investments are in fact, being driven by an endless and an unachieved and aspired to mission towards more and better investment. And I think asking what more needs to be done is less interestingly, very less interesting intellectually speaking, than asking what then are the constructions of success thus far at a national level, at a regional level, and at local level, and what justifies the continued existence of this framework within the national context. In under a minute or so, I'm not quite sure here that I'm not quite sure here, and here I'm just quite conscious of what was said yesterday, whether Africa more broadly falls in that clean pattern of developmental state, and whether we can argue that there are possibilities of developing that, those kind of states, but more needs to be done. Yes, I can see that. So we're talking about Botswana, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, but I'm not sure whether it doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black in terms of the governance framework, but one that delivers social transformation. In conclusion, we see that international and global development are politically a shorthand for a set of countries defined by their ability to disperse resources. But this ability has tended to scupper or abort the national projects that we saw in the 1960s with Kenneth Kaunda. And I think more needs to be done in not only exposing the realities of foreign investment in local communities, but also how policy tools and legal tools can be made to intersect with the assumptions of success at local level with communities, but assumptions of success as well in the NGO or academics. We should be able here to challenge responses from a very significant epistemic community, more broadly internationally, a well-resourced community acting through a networked set of institutions, bilateral, multilateral, charitable, and corporate, powerful, and the network of influence touches all spheres of life. But the question that I have for Thandika Mkandawire and maybe everyone here is, why do these realities produce and continue to reproduce themselves? And what alternative pathways can we chart forward? Yeah, thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Sabal here. So basically what I'm presenting, well, first of all, let me thank Grieve Shelwa and Zainab Al-Bernousi and the whole Africa Institute for inviting me and for allowing me to kind of benefit from this amazing debate. So what I'm presenting here is the result of, well, it's not new. It's the result of, say, a decade of research, mostly undertaken between Uganda, Tanzania, and South Africa on sugar. So it's a topic very much in continuity with what Simon was saying before. So most of the kind of result of this research have already been published in journal in the Global North and in the Global South, particularly in the Agrarian South, which is the journal that was founded by Sam Moyo, this sort of tricontinental solidarity sort of publisher that joins Zimbabwe, Brazil, and India, which I suggest you give a look at. So titles of my today's presentation is Sugar Agroextractivism in Africa. Subtitle is Land Enclosures, Contract Farming, and Socio-Ecological Conflicts. So I start from where Simon started, the idea of this 2007-2008 as sort of triggering this wave of large-scale land acquisition that many see as a newness. Others see this as a sort of a continuity with patterns of colonial dispossession very much kind of present, especially in settler colonies. So there has been, of course, debates as to whether this wave of land grabbing, large-scale land acquisition was a positive or a negative thing. We see, for example, international financial institutions seeing this as a development opportunity and kind of trying to sort of spearhead this sort of investments, while critics have been starting to kind of opposing this patterns of land expropriation, and they've been essentially labeling them as grabbing, right? So you have the word grabbing essentially coming out of a bunch of critical scholars, Wendy is there, but also, I would say, sustained process of resistance from below that actually in many ways try and kind of put very clearly what these forms of large-scale land investments were all about. Right, so in many ways, the critiques and the forms of resistance have showed patterns of violence, displacements, often extrajudicial executions. So they have been able to criticize it. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is first trying to understand what have been the drivers of this wave of acquisition, particularly around sugar. Particularly around sugar cane, which is in a way, one of the paradigmatic crops, not the only one, but I would say one of the paradigmatic crops, especially in Africa, that has been driving this wave of acquisition. So I try to understand why sugar, why in Africa, and then I try to understand what are the implications in terms of land, labor, and nature. In other words, I'm trying to understand how these forms of enclosure actually shape patterns of land holding, patterns of land mobilization, and try to engage with a sort of a broader set of issues related to ecological transformation. So, dealing from Mkandawire kind of push at interdisciplinarity. I've been trying to work on kind of the intersection between political economy, political ecology, and political sociology by trying to understand also how people kind of respond to these forms of grabbing. And again, drawing from Thandika Mkandawire, Mkandawire used to say, like, if you want to work on agriculture, you got to start from the peasantry. Because the peasantry essentially was the great social actor that I see we find essentially missing in many of the debates over large-scale land acquisition and so on. So let's say first, why sugar? So sugar cane has been, again, a crop that has been expanding massively. In the continent, there is more or less only 6% of the global cane produced, but the potentials for growth are massive. One of the arguments that has been made as why sugar cane is related to the fact that, according to data, apparently 60% of these large-scale land deals involve flex crops. Now, the notion of flex crops is an interesting notion because it makes us understand that essentially this wave of sort of land privatization, marketization, and the overall assault on African agriculture started, of course, we know there is a long history. It started with colonialism, but it was actually amplified by the fact that large-scale investments in monocropping were extremely risky, right, for both climatic and market reasons. So when you have these flex crops that basically allow you to produce sugarcane, but basically then decide whether you want to turn it into sugar or ethanol or bioplastic and so on, then of course this allows agribusiness companies to diversify the risks, right, and to kind of shift most of the production where it's most convenient. Just to give you an example, Brazil, which is the largest sugar producer in the world today, uses 60% of its sugar cane for ethanol, not for sugar, right? So this gives you a sense of how this changed radically, you know, the role of sugar in this context. So another question is why Southern Africa has become a little bit the core of this expansion. Now, for those who know, I mean, I see there's a bunch of South African scholars, you know, like most of the giants on sugar in Africa is Ilovo, which is the largest producer that has been, at the end of the apartheid period, kind of expanding in Southern Africa massively. So one of the questions that I've been trying to look at is why South African giants are relocating and are expanding in this region. And the answers I found is the fact that, one, most of these areas, most of these countries are the countries where sugar is more expensive. So, for example, I have some data, if I find them, so that shows that, so Swaziland so in other words, most of the Southern African countries were countries where a lot of sugar was produced and was consumed, and the cost was very high. So this reminds me a little bit of Sidney Main's argument. I don't know if those who have read Sidney Main's. Sidney Main's basically was arguing that sugar was adopted in Europe during the Industrial Revolution exactly to produce those extra calories that served to push the worker to the following day, because the rates of death during the Industrial Revolution were incredible, right? So this is what I've been seeing in Africa. So you see, for example, that South Africa is number 6 country in the world in terms of per capita consumption, Swaziland number 10, Malawi 11, Tanzania 13, Zambia 14, Mozambique 15. Also, again, the countries where the retail price have been higher are also in this region. So we find Zambia number 4, Mozambique number 7, Uganda 8, Tanzania 10, Malawi 12. So we see there is a whole political economy of sugarcane that is actually showing us that there is an interest for many of these actors to situate themselves into these countries, mostly from sort of market opportunities and of course also the kind of the general sort of environment they find. Now, in my subtitle to this presentation, there is a shift from land enclosure to contract farming, which has been, I think, the other key discourse that we see today in agricultural debates. Now, contract farming is essentially a form of sort of coordination between farmers and agribusiness companies through contractual agreements that basically establish the quotas of production, the times of productions, the varieties, and so on and so forth. So, this contract farming has received a lot of legitimization. Why? Well, because all this wave of land enclosure that preceded contract farming schemes was, as I said, contested. Right? So even when you have to displace people, well, and you have to resort to political violence, this is costly. So land grabbing has been has got a lot of acceptance because it was allowing many governments to repel allegations of dispossession and grabbing. So it is actually the sort of participatory nature of contract farming that has been making it so kind of desirable. Also because, again, the key argument has been that, again, contract farming differently so was framed as an alternative to land grabbing, and actually, a form of inclusive business model or inclusive development, right? So exactly because on paper, on theory, rather than dispossessing or displacing the people that are based there, you integrate them as farmers. Now, in theory, this works, but the reality is that I don't see this antagonism. Like contract farming and land enclosure to me are basically, they express the same sort of agro-extractivist nature, and now I'm trying to explain why. So basically, I argue in these papers that all this emphasis on this una tantum kind of forms of land dispossession distracted the attention from the everyday politics of dispossession that actually occurs not through state violence, but through market coercion. Right, so for example, we have been seeing how rather than keeping farmers on the land, we have been seeing, so if you understand for a moment like a bit of technical issues, you understand that sugar is an industrial crop. It's not, in order to be grown, you need inputs, you need capital, you need water. And so many of the farmers that have kind of joined this, the bandwagon of agrarian modernization through sugar production ended up finding themselves in huge conditions of debt. So in many case studies I've been kind of exploring across Africa, that was the constant. So it's like sugar is driving that, is pushing farmers into debt. Why? Well, because I think Simon knows this well, but especially in Zambia, but in many other kind of circumstances, we have seen that many of these sugar companies have a monopolistic and monopsonistic position, which basically allows them to establish the price, to establish the quotas of production. And so, of course, farmers have found themselves in a conditions of fixed or declining prices to the producer paid by the company, and growing cost of inputs, say fuel, fertilizer inputs, and the end result was that, right? And with that, many farmers that were trying, of course, to get credit, you understand that, in these schemes, it's also financial capital reaping benefits. So just to give you a sense, commercial banks charge farmers around more than 20% interest rates for this kind of. So it turns out that when a farmer gets this kind of credit, he has to mortgage the land. And when you go on default, you lose the land. And then what happens that the bank sells the land to those larger farmers that are actually richer and they can afford. So the overall result of this is a process of displacement of the less sort of efficient producers, a sort of a survival of the fittest, which seems to me the kind of the dream of the World Bank, right? Which wants to give the land to those most kind of efficient producers. Then, of course, we need to see what efficiency is about, right? So in this sense, we have been seeing how contract farming, rather than solving rural poverty, has been an incubator of social differentiation with larger, I mean, it's basically the lesson of the Green Revolution. The larger and medium-scale farmers that have more capital and then can join the bandwagon of the agricultural modernization, they can benefit. The overall majority, they don't, right? So it gives you a sense of how, rather than a leveling playing field, it's actually a very uneven playing field between them. So I wanted to make a reference. So often then land changes. And another element of reflection is labor. So we see that in these sugar complexes, labor is also kind of devalorized in order to be overexploited. So we see that there is kind of migrant labor, wage labor, and so on in different forms of agreement, whether seasonal, casual, whether permanent. But there is a whole set of hierarchies that are both based on different forms of contract and on gender. But what I've been finding interesting here is that often people do not really pose attention. They only pose attention to this wage labor, in other words, wage labor that is recognized and can be traced. What people do not give a look at is this hidden labor done by most of the members of the household, namely women and children, that actually do most of the work, well, not the work of cutting, because this is a hard work that requires migrant workers and so on, but most of this hidden work of the women that is essential to social reproduction is in a way essential to the very reproduction of the scheme. In other words, without this unpaid, non-monetary and kind of invisible sort of work of women, the overall schemes could not reproduce. So this is sort of a subsidy to capital, right, that actually exploit the non-paid work of women. So we see, again, a much more complex set of processes. And we have been seeing this, again, in Uganda, we have been seeing in Tanzania, but also in other cases in Zambia, in Mozambique. We have found pretty much the same kind of question emerging. So we have been seeing how contract farming has spurred the creation of new dependencies, a power relation, for example, in the case of Malawi. We have seen in the work of Simon the shift from broad-based to narrow-based livelihoods. We have seen what I call the adverse or differential incorporation of farmers into this vertically structured global agricultural value chains. And in cases such as Mozambique, Bridget Olaglin has been actually talking a lot about this gendered nature of this process that is essential in order to understand this. There have been also a lot of ecological and health implications. That's the last part of my presentation. Ecology. So we generally, what I've been trying to understand is also how this large-scale land is transform, again, nature. And the first, of course, the most immediate thing that you think about is this question of deforestation, right? Because in order to create all this large-scale plantation, you need to cut the trees and you need to cut every form of nature that's existing. Now, the interesting story, like the paradoxical, is that it's not just the big agribusiness companies kind of shaping deforestation, but also the outgrowers themselves, because in a context where the only market available is sugar, outgrowers, in a sense, tend to maximize the portions of land dedicated to sugar, because they know that will give them back money, right? Which is one of the biggest problems for farmers, like the absence of safe markets. So farmers get into this kind of scenario, and they try to maximize the use of land for sugar. One of the biggest problems is obviously food security, because of course when you use most of your land to feed external people, and of course you don't dedicate most of the land to produce food, then you end up into the trap of food insecurity. So we have, for example, region as Busoga in Uganda, that was the food basket, there was the region from where the food was sent to the humanitarian emergencies in Somalia and in Sudan, now being turned into a sugar belt. So from being the food basket of the country, now it has been turned into a sugar belt, therefore kind of amplifying the processes of food insecurity. In the areas where we have been doing research, we found, for example, that malnutrition was truly widespread. So, you cannot eat sugar, right? So this is one of the questions. Another big question from the ecological point of view is soil degradation. It might seem banal, but the reality is that when you've been using a plantation for 20 years in an intensive manner without rest, the rentments are declining, and the costs to make it more productive are growing, right? So this has been, I got this sense from agribusiness companies that actually realize what are some of these problems. So one of the problems, as I was saying, is also water, because of irrigation on one end, but also because in order to extract the sucrose that you need huge quantities of boiling water that serve it to, you pour it on the crushed cane, and that makes easier the extraction of the sucrose. So you have a whole process of appropriation of the water sources. So for example, in the Kilombero Valley in Tanzania, it was found that, company have access, for example, in the Kilombero Valley, the company has access to 429,000 cubic meters per month at no cost. And then there has been finding that the Ruaha River, that just the affluent, in the period where there was a lot of this extraction, had gone down of 1 meter. And this had been actually affecting more than 1 million farmers that were depending from the Ruaha River for farming, right? So much of this, so you can see that both socially and ecologically, sugar is a true disaster, right? So the question is, have these forms of development interventions been contested or not? The answer is yes. The problem is that also the forms of contestation have been varying, because farmers are often not organized, and they have been often using what James Scott calls the weapons of the weak. In other words, non-confrontational, low-intensity struggle that do not expose you to the backlash of the strong, kind of powerful entity. Right? And so, for example, the most obvious form were the spread of malicious fires. Right? So, in other words, the farmers used to put fire, on the sugarcane of the company, right? In order to push it to gather harvest the sugar that they had planted, because often, even if there is contracts, Sometimes the sugar companies say, oh, okay, you should be waiting. You can wait a little bit because the market is saturated. So sometimes the quotas and the calendars that the company establish are not necessarily kind of maintained. And so this creates a number of, again, as I said, conflicts that takes sometimes a more open form, sometimes a more hidden form. I leave at that. Thank you.
I've been feeling a little bit out of place at the conference because I have mostly done my research in Latin America, and I'm not a political economist, but now I feel quite at home on this panel. Thank you very much for your comments. Basically, they said what I wanted to say, so I'm just going to add a little bit of extra detail, and then we can, on my case, and then we can have a conversation. I'll start. Everybody has been thanking Grieve and Sala and Sarah and the Africa Institute, so I'll just do something different and complain. My complaint is that when you organize such a good conference with great papers and in a beautiful place like this, it just makes it harder for the rest of us. So I'm kidding. Thank you very much. Tough crowd. Okay, so I'll start here. I have worked in terms of my research for a long time in Brazil, where I have followed the struggle for land with social movement activists, the Movimento Sem Terra, since the mid-1990s. In 2013, I followed research scientists, aid officials, diplomats, farmers, and activists from Brazil to Mozambique. All of these actors were, in very different ways, involved in this ambitious new project called Pro-Savannah. Some of them were protesting, some of them were supporting, but they were all there because of Pro-Savannah. So my talk today takes up Thandika Mkandawire's call to analyze what he calls the roots of institutional monocropping, or the way in which the historical production of knowledge shapes the landscape quite literally of what is possible for rural development in Mozambique today. Pro-Savannah was a trilateral project organized between Brazil, Japan, and Mozambique. It was the brainchild of political leaders in the first two countries, in Brazil and Japan. These two countries wanted to build on a collaboration from the 1970s that you might have heard of. This was when the two countries came together with the United States to form a project called Pro-Cerrado. According to official accounts, Pro-Cerrado was a huge success because it transformed idle land, quote unquote, in the center-west of Brazil into the frontier of the Green Revolution, into fields of gold, farms that were 4 times the size of farms in the rest of Brazil, large-scale, input-intensive soy and cotton. In the wake of the food and fuel crises of the late 2000s, which my colleagues have referred to, Brazil and Japan put their heads together again, and this time they decided to partner with Mozambique to transform what was pitched to be roughly 14 million hectares in the Central Nacala corridor into a modern, large-scale producer of commodity crops, particularly soybeans. For this project, each of the 3 countries, Brazil, Japan, and Mozambique, had a different role. Brazil was to contribute scientific research garnered from this decades-long soybean miracle. Japan would finance new rural development projects, what they call development models, and would also deepen the eastern port of Nacala to ship out bulk grain to Asia. And Mozambique would supply fertile land and willing labor. In anticipation, the project established a private fund to raise $2 billion in greenfield financing, and the Brazilian government mobilized farmers in Brazil who would travel to Mozambique to farm on the final frontier, or Africa. The project was one of many that emerged during this period that my colleagues have already described, which activists referred to as the global land grab, and Sam Moyo and his colleagues dubbed the second scramble for Africa. After a lot of fanfare and publicity, and maybe this is one place where I separate from Giuliano, Pro-Savannah met with huge protests. Protests in the north, protests in the south, and I would say these even paved the way for some of the protests that you see today. Pro-Savannah generated huge protests, and eventually the project really fell apart kind of spectacularly, but also quietly. By 2016, when I went to Mozambique to do extended research, the Brazilian farmers, scientists, and aid workers were packing up. Pro-Savannah went into hibernation, as one activist said. I talked to a lot of people, and I asked them, why did Pro-Savannah fall apart? And everybody had a different reason for why they thought it had failed. And these reasons all made sense, but I kept coming back to the same question that Simon posed, which was, why did anybody think it was a good idea in the first place? In this densely populated region of central Mozambique, where the majority of the population is economically vulnerable, farming on small plots of land, average size is about 1 hectare, using hand tools, how did Pro-Savannah, with its focus on foreign investment and large-scale mechanized commodity production for export, come to be seen and defended as the logical use of capital, science, land, and political power? Asking this question, which is different than the question of why it failed, but how did it come to be seen as feasible, means that we have to move away from a focus on Pro-Savannah as the object of study to Pro-Savannah as the window through which we understand the production of knowledge around agricultural research and rural development. Pro-Savannah's triumphant articulation has everything to do with a century of knowledge produced by colonial rulers and the post-colonial one-party state who saw and see the land and people of Mozambique as inputs into an extractive landscape of profit that I call the plantation ideal. In the abstract, and I'm going to go quickly because I can see the clock ticking down, which is sort of unnerving, the plantation ideal plays out in Mozambique like this, and this is sort of in the abstract, but many scholars have articulated this. A given plantation proposal or a mega project begins with a fantastical analysis, optimistic, spectacular, urgent, of what is possible to achieve with the application of external science and funding to local land and labor with the goal of producing products of one kind or another for external interests. These ambitious projects function as showcases that advertise Mozambique as open for foreign investment. Politicians and allies such as donors and multilateral agency officials see these projects as attractive. They're on sort of aid time or plantation time. They're attractive in part because these folks want quick results. They don't believe that the local population is capable of generating profits, no matter how productive they might be in the longer run. As the economist Castelbranco has argued, the desire for returns that can be produced quickly and pocketed means that those in the elite positions privilege the extraction of raw, unprocessed materials for the external market. So now we can rewrite the trilateral agreement between Brazil, Japan, and Mozambique. Brazil provides scientific research that facilitates extraction by developing and testing new varieties of export crops. Japan designs community development projects that offer subsistence-level resources intended to keep people, rural inhabitants, in their places rather than practicing mobile forms of swidden agriculture. And Mozambique devises new land laws that privilege private investors and create new aggregation schemes, these are the block schemes that Giuliano talked about, to coordinate and motivate local residents who will do the work. During colonial rule, an infrastructure of extraction, regulations, guards, taxes, tax collectors, local officials, tied local residents to plantations through force. Today, local residents engage in plantation projects because they offer some potential for access to markets and social goods, like education and running water. Although plantations across colonial and post-colonial Mozambique have failed to generate sustainable local or national development, and there's no question here. People think that the plantation is more efficient, it's more effective, it's going to generate these profits. There's no question that it has failed to do so, but this ideal persists, fundamentally shaping and being shaped by science, agriculture, and rural life in the country. High rates of rural poverty, small farm sizes, and the relative lack of farm machinery in use throughout the country are read as an opportunity rather than as an indictment of their historic and ongoing failure. And for as long as the people in power have plantations in their sights, longer-term and people-focused development goals like schools, internal markets, healthcare, skill building, etc., all of these take a back seat. That's in general how the plantation ideal has worked, quote unquote, in Mozambique. What I want to do in the remainder of my time is provide a little bit more empirical detail on how the plantation ideal came to be and how it played out in pro-Savannah. From the early years of Portuguese rule, government officials, international experts, and local bureaucrats all argued that East Africa's rightful place was as a producer of tropical plantation products. The archives from the early period of colonial rule are filled with invocations of Portugal's glory and celebrations of the nation's prowess in having discovered East Africa. They made their claim through the claim to discovery, and they recount the seemingly endless possibilities for making the land flourish. The plantation was seen as the key to unlocking this profit and prosperity. Mozambique's ecology was compared favorably to surrounding regions such as Natal and Rhodesia. Visitors to the territory called upon administrators to establish research centers to determine the best cultivars and production practices and to share these findings with European colonists who would oversee local residents who would do the work. Local labor was necessary, it was argued, because Europeans were not suited for such labor in tropical conditions. The influential American agronomist, Otis W. Barrett, he was the head of the USDA in the early 1900s. He toured the territory in 1908. He waxed enthusiastic in his official reports, claiming that with external investment, scientific research into tropical crops for the global market, and careful management of local labor, Mozambique would gloriously come into her own. For his efforts, Barrett became the first director of the new Agricultural Services Department in Mozambique in 1908. Over time, the scientific infrastructure that developed had several characteristics that are key today. First, a reliance on external funding for agricultural research, where Mozambican priorities are taken into account but interpreted through the interests and capacity of international aid agencies, to Aude's point. Second, a focus on commodity production for the external market, which narrows the focus of research and pins it almost exclusively on breeding new varieties for commercial production, rather than investigations into local native varieties or into land management. Third, a separation between research and farmers, or extension and farmers. So research is seen as technical or scientific, but not applied, and definitely not applied to the poorest farmers who would likely not be engaging in these markets anyway. Fourth, the perspective or the view of local residents as laborers rather than farmers, whether they provide direct service on plantations or indirect through contract production. And I would agree with Giuliano that in the context of forced labor and forced aggregation in Mozambique, both the large-scale plantation and also contract farming are forms of essentially plantation. Although Mozambican government officials would insist in interviews that pro-Savannah was always intended to help small farmers, project documents and leaders focused from the beginning on research efforts that would help to build agro-industrial export capacity. They argued that the proposed large-scale plantations would, of course, have multiplier effects, creating development poles that would build on local technology to support the still incipient Mozambican private sector and a handful of larger farmers. The lead researcher for the Brazilian team said that the justification for pro-Savannah, in his eyes, was always large-scale agriculture, particularly the expansion of soy. And he was very frustrated that Mozambicans didn't want to take up soy production when he was there. The focus of modernized farmers to the exclusion of actually existing localized residents was highly racialized. The top-ranking Brazilian technician here for Pro-Savannah insisted that Pro-Savannah didn't fail because of the Brazilians or because they brought inappropriate technology. Rather, the problem was that Mozambicans themselves didn't have the skills to keep up or the drive to work out difficult problems. Macuas, as he called the Mozambicans, referring to the largest ethnic group in the north, Macuas are very lazy. They don't want to work hard. They have basic technological skills, but they need better management, and they need to stop burning and moving around, end quote. The idea that Brazilian scientists could bring technologies developed elsewhere to Mozambique was justified in the project's vision, both by the notion that Brazil's environment was similar, what they referred to as parallels, to Mozambique, and by the singular focus on the selection and cultivation of new cultivars as politically neutral technologies that could be adapted to the Mozambican context via universally recognized scientific techniques. And so here you have a page from the World Bank report where the World Bank economist said, how could it be difficult to transfer technology when Brazil and Mozambique were connected at the hip 4 million years ago? Brazilian scientists were confident that agricultural development would flow from the right varieties. So Felix Paulo, who's the director of Pro-Savannah, said in 2016, Pro-Savannah starts with the assumption that improved varieties will increase agricultural income, for whom he doesn't say, transforming subsistence agriculture into modern, intensive agriculture mechanized by the promotion of initiatives oriented towards the market. Brazilian researchers assumed that these new varieties would be Brazilian, given their country's experience and research on relevant crops, and they considered themselves the leaders of the tropical green revolution. The focus on breeding new varieties characterizes agricultural research in Mozambique more generally, and it tends to come at the expense of considerations about adoption. Most of the scientific research projects outside of Pro-Savannah and including Pro-Savannah ended with a demonstration of crop characteristics on farmer fields or in research stations in farmer field days. But none of the researchers I spoke to were able to factor adoption into their work, whether prior to breeding or afterwards. As one scientist with a large international research organization put it, quote, scientists say, I'm not a politician. We are worried about technical problems. We are worried about the number of varieties we liberate. This is a serious problem, end quote. As a result of this focus on breeding, there's very little scientific research on land management. One scientist who was with the main agricultural research agency for the country, U.A.E, he dismissed land management alternatives like conservation agriculture or working through farmer field schools as, quote, a thing of the university, theoretical work rather than applied practical research. A grant maker from the FAO office in Maputo agreed, saying that conservation agriculture or working with local materials like live mulch and dead mulch, that was just a thing for poor people. Mozambique needed research that would help it to develop, he insisted, and that meant orienting research toward market crops and commercial farmers. This emphasis is shaped in part by the preferences of external donors who are usually headquartered in other countries and interested in projects that can be scaled up. Scaling up is the holy grail of development work. And that same grant maker from the FAO, who I quoted before, said, the donors have areas of preference. For example, I'm not going to talk about gender or human rights with the Japanese embassy. They don't have any interest. But if I talk about the issue of fishing, I can do that with the Italians. If I talk about wildlife and forest, I can do that with the Germans. And if I discuss the topic of gender, I go to the Norwegians. If I want to talk about emergency questions, some rural poverty, I can do that with the British. If I want irrigation, I can talk to the Japanese. If I want statistics, I talk to the Swedes. The Mozambican state has codified impressively inclusive national policies, such as the land policy of 1995 and the land law of 1997. But the state lacks the will to oversee the most important aspects of community rights and consultation. Instead, today the state is rewriting its land laws in order to further facilitate private external investment. And the primary contact between the state and small farmers in the rural areas is in the form of paternalistic and opportunistic handouts, and over the last 4 or 5 months in the form of campaigning. So, in conclusion, the question, what is to be done? What comes after the devastation of plantation death? So I've been working with a colleague from Mozambique who's been based in Maputo for a while, Natasha Bruna. She works with the OMR, or the Rural Observatory of Mozambique. Together, Natasha and I asked academics and activists from across the country what they thought the right path forward was for Mozambique today. And these are individuals who've been working in rural development and in activism for many years. The main argument that these activists and others make is that local communities should be the means and the end of development, rather than just a means to the end. And that local communities need to be producers of knowledge about the possibilities and about the practices in development. I'll just give you a couple because I'm out of time. Anabela Lemos, who's the director of Justiça Ambiental, she argues that Mozambique needs to rescue ancestral practices, agroecology, and the use of native seeds and crops. She advocates for small-scale processing facilities that provide a price floor and guarantee purchase. And I can go down the list. And I would say that none of these alternatives seem like rocket science. They're actually quite simple alternatives, but they really show you how the alternative of a simple future based on small-scale agriculture in many ways is more fantastical in Mozambique than ambitious large-scale mega projects. They're trying to resuscitate what has been in the shadows and bring it out to the fore. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these very rich presentations. As a discussant, I'm supposed to discuss. But the issue is that I'm an outsider of the field. I'm not an expert on Mozambique, South Africa, or Zambia. As a matter of fact, I'm not even an economist. I'm an anthropologist. So you can see that the task that I have in front of me is really daunting, yet I found a way to deal with it. And this is how. Someone famous, and because he's famous, I will not mention his name, once said that there are two types of people that may ask highly relevant questions that may change a given field. And he mentions these two types. One of them are young people, mainly because they have not been disciplined yet. So they can ask questions that may seem silly, that may seem stupid, but those questions usually point out to what's most self-evident in a field. So clearly, this is not me. I mean, I'm not that young. And the second type of people is an outsider to the field, who usually, because he or she doesn't have the habits of the field, can point out to aspects, assumptions, ideas that are really self-evident, and they may trigger new thinking about the issue at hand. So this is, I'm not going to do that. As a matter of fact, I'm saying just this idea from this famous person encouraged me to ask a number of questions that may seem very basic to my colleagues, and hopefully they will generate discussion. My field really that I associate with is anthropology. So the perspective that I will be giving is an anthropological perspective. And usually, at the heart of anthropology is a radical critique of Eurocentrism. And Eurocentrism is not really at odds with the work of Samir Amin, who precisely did that. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book called Eurocentrism, and it's a critique of Eurocentrism. When we say Eurocentrism, It doesn't mean dismissing Europe. It doesn't mean dismissing American, European views. It only means relativizing them. It also means making them less hegemonic. It also means integrating other views and perspectives. So in anthropology, for instance, we have a very important book that constitutes the foundation of what we call economic anthropology. It's written by a man, his name is Marcel Mauss, and he's French, and the book's title is Le Don. I say it in French because it's translated in English as the gift. I'm not going to make it long. Through a thorough examination of donations throughout different cultures, Marcel Mauss came to the conclusion that there is nothing called donation. There is something called donation exchange, meaning that a donation always asks to be returned. So when we talk about aid in this context, about assistance, about donations, I think we need to kind of like decolonize this concept. What do we really mean when we say donation? But also different other terms. What do we mean when we say a state? In anthropology, there is a whole field that pertains to the idea of state, and we have all kinds of views. Really, I mean, like at opposite sides. Some of them argue for that state exists, and there are some people that even argue, anthropologists, that state has no existence in real life. And of course, we have all kinds of views in between. So therefore, when I read, and I read in 4 papers quite a few times, the African state, that's to me, it makes it more problematic because as a matter of fact, in North Africa, in the Maghreb, we never say the North African state. That's despite the fact that Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Mauritania, they are very close. Yet at the same time, their states are so quite different that we cannot really put it under one single label as the Maghrebi state or the North African state. So I want to know, like from the speakers, I mean, what does really the African state mean in this? Can we use that concept? And who came up with that concept in the first place? And there's also another concept that's associated to this one, which is the developmental state that also I read in one of those papers. So this makes it even twicely problematic. In addition to the problem of the state, we have the problem of development. In anthropology, we don't have this concept. As a matter of fact, we do, but not in this sense. So we have a book, for instance, by Clifford Geertz. It's called Islam Observed, Religious Developments in Morocco and in Indonesia. But when you read it, as a matter of fact, even from the title, he's talking about religious change in Morocco and Indonesia. So it's fine like that anthropologists may, as a matter of fact, in certain circumstances, use the concept of development, but they really mean change. Why? Because like the concept of development resonates with another concept that anthropologists really don't like, that they have fought against for a very long time, which is basically the concept of progress. That development is really a situation in which you have all kinds of like improvement, economic, intellectual, and so forth. In addition to that, it seems to me from the presentations, but also from what I heard the last 3 days, or last 2 days actually, development is measured by measurements that are not coming from within those cultures. I will just give you actually 2 small examples. The first one, it was just said yesterday that I think the Angola, after independence, had 10 doctors, 10 medical doctors trained in Western medicine. I'm sure, I don't know Angola, I've never been there, but I can bet that it had thousands and thousands of healers, meaning that Angola, like any other country, must have developed a whole medical tradition that sometimes we call tradition medicine, that has been at one point, as a matter of fact, even dismissed by anthropology as being witch medicine, or sometimes they even call them witch doctors. And we see a phenomenon lately, especially in the United States, as a matter of fact, even in Europe, that Western medicine itself goes back to this type of medicine. In States, one of the trends that you have is that Western American trained doctors go to India to be trained in Indian medical medicine or in Chinese medical medicine. So the point that I was trying to make is that precisely because the issue of decolonizing knowledge came out again today, to what extent, or rather, what are the conditions that allow us in the field, that I'm not part of course, in this specific field, to kind of like challenge those concepts and possibly come up with indigenous new concepts that capture better the realities of these countries that, even though they are Africans, they are quite different from each other. Thank you very much, and I open it for the question.
Thank you so much, all the speakers, for this important issue, land agriculture in Africa. My name is Mustafa Ahmed. I'm from Egypt. So I have a question to Professor Gilano regarding to the investment in land in Africa and agriculture. So when we talk about land in Africa, it comes also to our mind the issues of environmental issues, legal issues. So do we really take into consideration when we invest in Africa or in land in Africa about the safeguards, measurements, which is quite important to save our lands and also to protect the people who have indigenous people maybe, or the people who had the ownership of the land, and also make our land to be more productive, not to exploit the land for that. Thank you so much.
We can take different questions and then go back.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Zikiru. I'm from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. My question is directed to, shall I say, Professor Amanda in this case, who made the classic presentation on Zambia. The question goes as follows. Considering the current critical perspectives on the developmental state in Zambia, what alternative models for agricultural development could better address the needs of smallholder farmers while ensuring equity as well as sustainability? Thank you so much.
Thank you. The next question will be from me, Majid. I think I qualify both the points that you mentioned, silliness and level of stupidity, and I'm coming from humanities. So I'd like to ask a different set of questions. What has really inspired me to ask this question is particularly one presentation given by a professor from Northwestern University previously and now from Giuliano and Wendy, because you have given us an opening to really to account for the people's participation in disrupting policies. Maybe would have liked to hear more about maneuvering, negotiation. Even what does it mean to also bring initiatives from the people outside of the state apparatus and the state thinking. So my question is, are we limited by this idea of the developmental state, which has also centered the state? And the state has been central in almost all of the discussions in this conference. So what kind of delinking are we doing here while we have been also inheriting these kinds of categories which have been really palpable in positivist studies. My second question is, this is, if I take it, this is hyper-local. The next one would be the transnational. Even in Vijay's talk yesterday, what we, as much as we are being, tending to anticipate the arrival of a new horizon, even China is arriving with all its national interests, right? So can we think of international solidarity, which is all the more urgent because of the global dominance that you all have been discussing? So what is the possibility and how can we really do international solidarity? Thank you.
Thank you very much for all these questions. I will share a few thoughts and just address different ideas and questions I've heard so far. But to answer the question of the definitions, and I quickly went onto the OECD website to find a definition of international assistance. So official development assistance, as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development organization defines it, is defined as government aid designed to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries. Loans and credits for military purposes are excluded. Aid may be provided bilaterally by donors to recipients or channeled through a multilateral development agencies such as the UN. Aid includes grants, soft loans, and the provision of technical assistance. OECD maintains a list of developing countries and territories. Only aid to these countries counts as official development assistance. Obviously, the OECD is a Western organization. I think it's important to note that, as you mentioned, who defines this concept? Who defines international aid? Who defines what is a development countries? And earlier, I heard a question on the concept of global South. Obviously, there have been also within the developing aid sector many discussions and critiques around the concept of developments versus developed versus developing countries. But obviously, at the root of all these issues come the question of power and who holds the power to define what is aid, what is a recipient, what is a beneficiary, but also who is a knowledge producer. Because what I was mentioning in my presentation is that with that top-down approach that we have through international assistance, whether it is in the agricultural sector or peace building or else, humanitarian sector, is that there is a constant marginalization in sidelining of what is local knowledge of producers, what is capacity, what is skills, and we always come back to this question of, local actors don't have skills, they don't have knowledge, they don't have capacities. And I think that it is very important to systematically and strongly denounce these methodologies and these approach and paradigms. And so at the end of the day, I totally agree with you, is that we need to think about endogenous models of assistance, of investments. I mean, maybe there is something else, right, that we haven't thought about yet. But because we're so confined within the current model of aid, even if we are talking about decolonizing, we still remain within that paradigm. And I think that that's unfortunately doesn't necessarily open the door for more radical thinking. And I know that in cities like DC, just saying the word radical is already problematic. And very quickly, and perhaps also I ask questions to my colleagues who are experts in agriculture, but when it comes to the question of ownership of land, the opportunities for local people to disrupt policy, obviously it seems that, this question of agricultural investment aids, well, what is actually interesting is that you've talked about investments into the agricultural sector for exports, while I talked about aids for local needs. And so there is definitely an issue there, right, where we're talking about investing in the agricultural sector for external needs, and when it comes to internal needs, we are relying on aid. So how do we disrupt that? And when it comes to the opportunity of local people to weigh in, the things that my peers in Senegal were telling me, and that's the general issue, is that local actors who are sidelined from the traditional AIDS sector do not have access to donors. They do not have the opportunity to discuss with them. They do not have access to these issues, to these stakeholders that have the money and the power. And so that's obviously also very problematic. So just to say that I definitely agree with what has been said, and unfortunately, we still evolve within the status quo, and it's extremely complicated to even for these actors to have a chance to disrupt these paradigms.
Maybe I'll just take a crack at some of the questions, but I'm not the best person to start with the first one because I don't think I used the North African state, nor would I invoke a state at a broader level than the state that I'm more familiar with, which would be the Mozambican state. And there I use it in a very meso level, not as a macro level theoretical category, and not just as a micro level empirical reality. I think the scholars like Sérgio Chichava, Castel Branco at U.A.E in Mozambique, drawing on Philip Abrams and Timothy Mitchell, seeing the state as both a set of institutions and also an arena of power that imbues within people a sense, hails them as particular kind of actors, I think is important to look at. So a very maybe differentiated way of analyzing the state. But I want to take just a quick crack, and I know my colleagues would as well, about the question of land, because I absolutely agree with you that land is special. So Polanyi talks about land, labor, and capital, and the fictitious nature of that commodification. But land, I think, is particularly detrimental when you bring paradigms that see it as a commodity or input for production, divorcing it from the many grounded ways in which it is understood and lived or experienced as identity or stability, as homeland, as security, as fatherland. So we do a real violence when we think about land in very narrow ways, and any given piece of land has multiple owners, multiple claims on it, multiple jurisdictions, not to mention the teeming with life sense of ecologies that Giuliano mentioned. So definitely something that has to be taken very seriously. I think about the alternatives, and here I'd love to hear more from my colleagues. There are so many active negotiations and resistances. So some of it is definitely the weapons of the week that you mentioned, where people resist in maybe covert ways. It's very difficult. You can look at the political situation in Mozambique right now. It's very difficult to put your life on the line by overtly protesting. But people have been, and particularly have been protesting in relation to pro-Savannah in the context that I shared, where there are real differences and strategies, groups that are mapping their community land in order to protect it from investment, or groups that are lobbying UNACI, the peasant union, lobbying with the government for a different way of thinking about investment. So firmly saying no to pro-Savannah, as opposed to the platform up in Nampula, which says, no, we want investment. So there's real difference of opinion among these different groups. We want the investment, we just want to dictate how it gets done. So instead of you coming to us and saying we have this ready-made program that we're going to roll out, instead saying, we have a sense of what we can imagine doing with this much money, and we'd like to put that into place. So many different ways of organizing resistance. I think in terms of transnational solidarity, also a really good question. And some of the work that we've done over the last 10, 15 years has been to try to fund research into local examples of land grabs or land deals that people who are in the regions would know more about and would be able to study, to organize meetings or conferences where we can fund people to come and talk not only to each other, but also to representatives of the FAO, of the World Bank, of the UN, and discuss the sort of particularities of their particular cases. So we've been doing that pretty regularly since 2010 and have built up, I think, a good set of both cases and a scholar activist network that is plagued by all of the inequalities that we see here and that we've talked about, but that is trying to have knowledge produced from people who are living those realities instead of just having it be produced by those who are extracting it.
Yeah, just a first comment to what you're saying. I mean, one of my kind of professors, Mahmoud Mamdani, recently wrote, well, not recently, a while ago, he wrote a book called Define and Rule, not divide and rule and define and rule. So I mean, following your kind of line of inquiry, I also believe that the power of defining things in a certain manner is still determining. I think when this research here, I think, is just kind of brilliantly showing how you have a genealogy of concepts that are kind of created and they take superiority over others. Now, your mention of Marcel Mauss makes me think about, all this economic anthropology, like Mauss, Malinowski, and others. They were exactly venturing in what you ventured, right? This idea, for example, Malinowski was trying to show that the exchange is not necessarily economically driven. In other words, not necessarily driven to a sort of economic interest, but actually there is all this sort of mutuality status, the Argonauts of Pacific, people traveling across the archipelago of islands just to deliver shells. Yeah, exactly, that was the name. So I think on this question, I think the question of the way in which land is differently defined, to me, is the most interesting thing. Because you can see, for example, that in, I don't know, if you read, say, Archie Mafege, he can make you understand this very clearly when he says that, in African social thought, you don't have this thing that's called property rights as a form of exclusive access and control of something. You don't have it. You have a form that's much more kind of similar to what you call usufruct rights. And in fact, if you say living in a community, in a rural community, and you have a piece of land assigned, if you travel for, say, 10 years, that land not stays with you if you do not occupy it, if you do not use it. Yeah, so all this kind of new paradigm of land property and private property and so on has been brought in massively, and this, I think, still kind of eroding alternative ideas over land, including forms of communal land tenure and so on, which actually have a different genealogy, right? So you see how they emanate from different centers of power. So I think this question is very interesting. So we should ask about land epistemologies, right? Like asking how the bodies of knowledge production over land are kind of created and where do they come from? Like now we see, for example, that the World Bank is actually a key actor, has been pushing for the last 20 years for formalization, titling, privatization, and so on, in the front of kind of land tenure system that were and are actually still in many ways functioning. If we think that land tenure system in many ways function to, say, moderate conflicts and moderate the forms of distribution, well, they were, we can say, pretty effective. In fact, if you are a woman and today you need to access land, well, even if it's patriarchal, and you need a husband to access it, but better than needing purchasing power in order to access land, right? And I think this has been also a debate into what has been kind of keeping people on the continent, on land, sorry. The question over if there is safeguard measurements to protect indigenous people and so on. I mean, this should be obviously part of of sort of the agreements and the deals, but it seems to me that African states, not to generalize, but certain African states are not really interested in this, but are more interested in a sort of a competition over attracting foreign direct investment. So I compete with another country on who provides you the better conditions, say fiscal exemption, say the possibility of repatriating profits, the possibility of evading health regulations or ecological regulations. So, it's like many of these deals, if not done with the state that has a certain will, but then again, also this question about reducing the state to a technical sort of institution. This is something, let me say something, I've been reading Mkandawire for many years, say before the idea of the developmental state, which to me is the less interesting thing. And not because I don't believe in the developmentalism, but when you live in Africa for some years and you see that, that the role of the state, by the way, in 1980s publication, Mkandawire was talking a lot about the state being predatory, but not just predatory, ambivalent and contradictory vis-à-vis the countryside, vis-à-vis the peasant, vis-à-vis rural productivity. So I would like to understand then, more. I mean, of course, I understand the political vision that's behind this. But again, I mean, seeing the state from the countryside and the way in which the state tries to increase the legibility of the countryside through these kind of new laws that allow to capture, the actors of the countryside. Yeah, it's something that I think makes me more interested in his work than ideas over the development. Yes, we can use the developmental state to rethink maybe what kind of different agricultural policies we can imagine. I stop at that otherwise.
Yeah, I think I will respond to two issues just in the interest of time. The first one is on the political reactions from below. I once visited a sugarcane plantation in southern Zambia, and in the middle of that plantation were two grave sites, two tombstones. That plantation was foisted on a former gravesite for the community, but one family refused to remove those. So it's sort of a funny side. You've got sugar, a grass crop around these two tombstones, and the family refused to move and refused the compensation. The second one is the farmer associations, where farmers are responding and challenging the intermediaries and the processor itself. And then because there's sort of a farmer agreement, the company is taking the farmers to court. And poorly resourced farmers with no legal representation, that process can really be daunting. So you see these reactions from below, but they're not consistent, one-off kind of events, and even malicious fires, one-off events here and there, but they're still emerging, and I think the remarkable work of documenting some of those is really interesting to look at. The final question is on the what sort of initiatives can work. I think it's from Kiru, alternative models. Just quickly, I don't understand why statutory land is more secure when it exists within the same country context. So communal land is not secure. It has to be registered, numbered. We have cases in Kabwe, for instance, where the local authority is giving out these certificates to local people, urban areas, but the utilization of land is still drawing on the communal sense. I think we need to think about initiatives that are existing. What does it mean to live well? What does it mean to survive on a piece of land? It doesn't have to be technocratic assumptions of you and me sitting in a. It's about talking to a farmer. What does it mean to have, to live well? What is well-being? There are people that I know, for instance, in Andaiminete, so my uncles would refuse to come to the city when I was in Lusaka. They can't stand a fence around them. They want the green space in the countryside. To have a look at the cattle, goats, and the like. That's the definition of success and well-being to them. And I think we need to look at the models that have existed, the interaction at the local level, and look at systems that can work at that scale, and then feed them into specific market dynamics that we are looking at.
Yeah, Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations and for the engaging discussion. We will continue to discuss this during lunch and during the breaks, and thank you very much.